Speakers are Eduardo Marques of the University of Sao Paulo and Phil Mook of the University College London. And so now I will give the floor to Eduardo.
Well, first of all, I would like to thank the organizers of the conference, Frank, who's not here yet, and Tom and Paul, especially you, the opportunity of being here and giving this talk. Well, I was asked to prepare a speech about urban marginality in Latin American cities, considering the general theme of the conference associated to the state. I consider this to be a real challenge, since even the idea of Latin American cities as a group to be compared must be nuanced. I will depart from a very strong statement considering the topic of my speech, which is there are no Latin American cities as such. There are several different countries with distinct historical, political, and geographical legacies. But at the same time, there are similarities and common processes to groups of countries and cities nested in the differences. At the same time, there are differences nested in the similarities. So, reviewing this similarities and differences, we may be led to an agenda for building better comparisons in the future. My presentation has three parts. The first one I organized a critical review of the most important theories about poverty in Latin America. Then I discussed these differences and similarities. And in the third part of the presentation, I sketched this agenda for comparisons, or the elements that should be accounted for in an agenda for comparisons in the region. And I decided, I had a presentation with a lot of data and graphs and things like that, and decided to drop everything and to put only pictures yesterday. I hope that you hear me, not only pay attention to the pictures. A very important point of departure for the discussion is an operational definition of poverty. So poverty is considered here to be a multidimensional state of relative absence of social and material well-being that generates reduction of choices and therefore of liberty. What relative means obviously varies historically and geographically, and is subject to political struggles and social interpretations that lead to socially accepted visions of social justice and to the establishment of rights by societies. People might have low levels of social and material well-being because they cannot access well-being, or because they cannot maintain the well-being they have accessed. So, to understand why people are poor, we must understand how people access the different sources of the different kinds of well-being, both by informal and by formal means. At least three sources of well-being must be considered in modern capitalist societies: markets, states, and sociability community. Additionally, the access to these sources may be facilitated or blocked by mid-level structures such as social networks and residential segregation. So, in order to understand poverty situations and poverty spaces, we must consider the joint effect of these three sources mediated by these two intervening mid-level structures. The existing macro-narratives about Latin America, poverty in Latin America, ignore these elements almost completely, focusing mainly on economic processes. The limits of these macro-narratives were not associated with the elements they brought, but with two main failures. They were too systemic, failing to capture the role of national and local processes. And there were two economicists, failing to consider the role of politics, of institutions, of political actors, their strategies and choices, as well as the different roles of nation states. The first theory is development theory, which suggested that development follows capitalist modernization. The prevalence of underdevelopment, therefore, would be caused by accommodation effects, which should fade away with time. Modernization should bring to the cities people with rural behaviors, who were detached from their rural origins, social connections, relationships of authority, and economic activities. As a result, they would develop anomic, provincial, unsubordinated, and lazy behavior, ending up as urban marginals, as thematized by this literature. Development theory was intensely criticized both by economic theory and later by dependence theory. They sustained that those supposedly marginals were in fact functional. These second group of theories suppose that those supposedly marginals were in fact functional to the peripheral capitalist economies of these countries. The contribution of those countries to the world capitalist division of labor would be to provide low-paid and poorly regulated labor forces. This would be possible due to the presence of a large informal economy that maintained alive a large reserve industrial army. And this situation was helped by the presence of authoritarian regimes at the time, pressuring salaries down. Therefore, in the moment of most intense economic growth, poverty was produced in large amounts. Growth and poverty were two faces of the same coin. This literature dialogued from afar with the French urban sociology literature of the 60s and 70s, but was produced later. In these theories, countries and cities of the region were compared as examples of general theories associated with the variation of development in the first case and the similarities of capitalist development in the second. In both cases, political processes and the state were left out of the analysis and were treated as products of macroeconomic dynamics. Since then, the region was rarely thematized comparatively in broad sense, although these two macro-narratives continue to be present implicitly in theories which sustain the supposed affinities between national and local urban processes, echoing the analysis of the 70s. Again, local elements, actors, conflicts, institutions, and struggles tend to be treated as peripheral details, leading to conclusions about the inevitability of processes and leaving no room for politics. So, which other elements should be accounted for? Then I go to the second part of the presentation, discussing similarities and differences in the region. The region contains at the same time similarities and differences. In fact, one of the major sources of these differences and similarities are the processes of state formation and the formation of social protection systems, institutional and political elements. These elements influence the formation of social classes and consequently of political actors, as well as the construction of the institutions that regulate political conflicts and socialize wealth and well-being. A similar point could be made concerning the processes of space production in each city. There are many sources of differences, but I had to choose to focus only on some, considering the time I have to this presentation, dropping the majority of the country details. And I refer to the article for the data and the information, specific information about that. So I start with the idea of the historical formation of Latin America, with two colonial projects, two different languages, and several ethnic and cultural heritages over a broad geographical region. The two colonial projects involve very different urbanization strategies in the colonies. This was combined with very different areas in geographical terms. For those who doubt the importance of the legacy of this long-term history, it's enough to observe that the four largest metropolises today in Latin America, outside Brazil, are the four capitals of the Spanish vice kingdoms: Mexico City, Lima, Bogota, and Buenos Aires. Obviously, several geographical and topographical elements have also been key for the development of these cities. Another great source of heterogeneity is associated with ethnicity, with strong effects on poverty. The differences started with the different relationships between each state and its indigenous population. Different economic cycles also brought slavery and marked differently countries and cities in economic, political, ethnic, and cultural terms. Latin America also received intense international migration since the end of the 19th century. And this, again, is happening now with new international migration waves, but at this time from poorer countries of the region to cities such as São Paulo, Buenos Aires, and Mexico City. All these processes influenced family structures, solidarity schemes, community organization, and sociability, with very important consequences to poverty and survival strategies. Different countries also created very diverse urban networks and scales. Latin America has 6 of the 29 cities which are expected to be megacities by 2025, according to UN estimates, although with decreasing population growth. The largest cities tend to be in Brazil, the country with more cities of at least 2 million. 12 cities among 22 in the region, against 4 in Mexico, 3 in Argentina, and 3 in Colombia. At the same time, urban primacy is smaller in Brazil than in other countries, although Brazil has the largest, São Paulo with 20 million, and the 4th, Rio de Janeiro, with 12 million. Then I think it's important to highlight a series of institutional and political processes which mark the region and have this idea, following this idea of nested differences and similarities. A first moment of parallelism included the transition from colonial rule to independence. Independence came to the region between 1810 and 1830 as a result of the incapacity of the Spanish metropolis to sustain its colonies after the Napoleon invasion. These processes happened with low presence of liberal ideas and very strong political presence of rural landlords, what marked the processes of nation formation, nation-state formation in several countries. The Brazilian case is similar, but in a way different, since the royal family crossed the Atlantic in 1806, and Brazil became the first colony to become the metropolis from one day to the other. This halted the installation of the Republic, but helped to prevent the disaggregation of the vast territory of the Portuguese colony. Independence came only in 1822, but with the creation of an empire and not a republic. The republic would come only in 1889, and the end of slavery only in 1888, again with low presence of liberal ideas and very strong political presence of landowners. The second and crucial moment, historical moment, concerns economic modernization and state formation in the first decades of the 20th century. Economic modernization came mainly in the 30s and the 40s, with strong presence of the state in processes of industrialization by substitution of imports. Not only being the state not only a producer, a direct producer of intermediary goods and infrastructure, but also the political conductor of the process. The best succeeded cases, Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico, managed to create relatively diversified industrial sectors and relatively capable state structures. Even among those countries, however, In some cases, the political strength of agricultural elites has made industrialization less generalized and more incomplete, and reduced state stability, the stability of state formation, such as in Argentina, especially during the military period, enhancing heterogeneity in the region. In other cases, rural elites were included peripherally in the modernization process, boosting industrialization and capitalist modernization, but maintaining other regions under the old forms of political control and economic development, such as in Brazil. The majority of the country's social policies, labor legislation, and social rights were granted by the state under authoritarian regimes. The formation of the Latin American protection systems, especially in Mexico and Brazil, involved the selective granting of rights subordinated to the positions of the individuals in the occupational structure, leading to a kind of regulated citizenship. In these cases, social rights were granted before the full acquisition of civil and political rights, inverting the classical order proposed by T.H. Marshall, and leading to a kind of stateship instead of citizenship. In the southern core, Argentina, Uruguay, and Chile presented a kind of stratified universalism until the 1970s, marked by more inclusive policies, at least in health, social security, and labor legislation. The third and most recent moment of parallelism and difference concerns the authoritarian governments and the return to democracy in more recent period. The majority of the largest and most important countries experienced authoritarian regimes between the 60s and the 80s. Some of these governments, Brazil and Mexico especially, intensified import substitution policies and conservative modernization. Urbanization and metropolization went to its peak, creating the Latin American metropolis we know today. Therefore, fast urbanization, intense migration, and proletarization happened under authoritarian political conditions, with civil and political rights suspended or seriously hampered. The presence of right-wing authoritarian regimes, however, did not define what kind of economic modernization was introduced, generating more heterogeneity again. A comparison between Argentina and Chile at one hand, at one side, and Brazil and Mexico on the other illustrates the point. And the last moment of historical parallelism dates from the 80s and the 90s, when all those countries transited back to democracy, introducing elections and new social actors. Social inclusion in a broader sense, after decades of increasing social inequalities under authoritarian governments, and more specifically the fight against poverty, housing precarity, and provision of social services, has been seriously impacted by these processes of return to democracy. Since these processes of redemocratization happened in the moment of the introduction of neoliberal ideas in the region. Several transformations were introduced in this period since then in the Latin American social protection systems, with different degrees of decentralization, participation, including institutionalized participation, privatization, and the growth of the third sector. The different combination of these elements between countries, however, varied substantially. In some countries, the reforms of the 80s and the 90s had clear neoliberal designs, being Pinochet's Chile the most prominent case. Peru, Bolivia, and Argentina, especially under Menem, also included privatization and neoliberal instruments. Brazil went in the opposite direction, strengthening a significant part of its federal social protection system. Access to policies and services has been improving, especially among the poor, but very important differences of quality are still present and are even increasing. As a whole, poverty has been declining in the urban areas, except for Argentina during the 2000 crisis. The single social process in evident and alarming increase is urban violence, with important consequences to urban segregation. Therefore, the recent period of democratization enhanced accountability and enlarged political participation in Latin America. This coincided with the moment of dissemination of neoliberal ideas internationally. However, their appropriation locally differed from place to place, with obvious consequences over poverty conditions. I'll return to this later. And what about spatial processes? A third group of elements includes urban structures, the production of peripheries, and urban precarity. In general, Latin American cities are marked by strong segregation, with the richer social groups located at central areas, where the scarce equipments and policies were since the beginning of the urbanization, while the poor and recently migrated population lived in vast, homogeneous and segregated peripheries. These peripheries were marked in the 70s by the absence of infrastructure, by precarious and irregular settlements, such as favelas, while the urban location of these later could also constitute enclaves of poverty in more central areas, such as in Rio de Janeiro. All of these would be self-built in collective processes by the own inhabitants during their free time. All those places were associated with negative cultural labels and territorial stigmas, impacting their social integration more generally, and also labor market participation. The state classically reinforced segregation by constructing a large-scale housing projects in extreme peripheries. In recent decades, peripheries are becoming more heterogeneous, at least in Brazil, due to the presence of high-income gated communities, but also because of the increasing presence of state infrastructure investments. The provision of states, however, varies considerably, even within countries. The presence of urban precarity in the region is high, but it's falling. According to UN estimates, the region has had in 2010 25% of its urban population living in irregular or precarious settlements. Although very high, this figure is lower than the average of developing countries, 33%, and it's declining. It used to be 34 in 1990, 29 in 2000, and 2010 became 24. The presence of precarity varies substantially between cities or even within countries. So considering all this, what should be accounted or incorporated in the analysis? Or which agenda should be incorporated? The production of empirically grounded comparisons between cities at the region might not leave aside social and political processes, as well as the role of political institutions. Since poverty is produced by different configurations of the access to markets, states, and sociability-community, taking into account segregation and networks, a minimum knowledge of the variability of these elements must be present in any solid comparisons. Among these elements, we know the dynamics around markets much better. In certain analysis, however, this had been equal to economic restructuring. Although it's clear that the opening of the economies in the last 10 or 20 years led to intense economic restructuring, this had very different concrete consequences in different countries, considering their productive structures, their degrees of protection, as well as the strategies implemented by the governments. Any grounded comparison should account for these differences. On the other hand, the public policy literature has been focusing on social processes in details, but this did not reach the urban studies debates. State actions in the region are discussed within urban studies debates under the general idea of neoliberalism, which simplifies and homogenizes a broad field marked much more by differences than by similarities, both between countries and between policy sectors. Let's take very fast Brazil as an example. Neoliberal ideas arrived late in Brazil, at the beginning of the 90s, and became important in economic policies. The core of social policies, education, health, and social assistance, however, received a neoliberal approach only during the Collor government, the guy who was impeached. The two longest and most important administrations of the period, Cardoso and Lula, did not implement neoliberal social policies. In fact, there was a clear process of policy learning between these two opposite governments in the constitution of federal policy systems and the reform of policy systems. Due to that, policy coverage has been increasing, although with large problems of quality. In the same period, urban policies were treated with a clear neoliberal tone only until the end of the Cardoso administration in 2002, but received an opposite treatment in the Lula government. Returning to our main subject, comparisons about poverty must incorporate the existing analysis in order to unfold these general categories and capture the differences between countries and policies. The third source of welfare, solidarity - sociability, is for sure the less known of all. At least three sub-themes should be highlighted considering solidarity: family and the demography of the poor, civil society and associations, and social networks and sociability. The demography of the poor has been changing substantially in recent decades. Migration, growth rates, and fecundity are declining in almost all countries in the region. In several countries, family arrangements are also changing, with the decrease of married couples with children and the increase of all other family arrangements. Regarding civil society, many things happened since the return to democracy, again with country variations. The phenomenon involves the reform of public policy sectors, which created many new arenas for participation. In analytical terms, it's increasingly important to abandon the theories based on autonomy and focus on the linkages, or the fit, as suggested by the neo-institutionalist, between activism and the state. The third facet of social solidarity involves sociability in itself and the structure of social relations, conforming social networks. Networks are relevant, represent very relevant mid-level structures that mediate the access to all sources of welfare, but they appear in the Latin American studies only metaphorically. The few existing studies on this subject confirm the importance of networks for poverty, but suggest that the presence of intense heterogeneity, indicating the urgency of future researches. While the role of kinship ties is better known, the importance of other spheres of sociability, as well as the effects of the variation of networks, are almost completely unknown. The less important element concerns residential segregation. The literature has accumulated substantial knowledge since the 70s, although not necessarily with comparable methods. We do know, however, that Latin American cities tend to be highly segregated in terms of social structures, income, and in sometimes ethnic attributes. We are much less certain, however, about the effects of these patterns in different cities, especially considering the mediation of segregation in the access to states and markets. Another important subject is the joint effect of segregation and networks in different urban contexts. In all these cases, the development of comparative analysis could contribute to the production of better comparisons of poverty in the region. Summing up and closing down, the development of comparative analysis of poverty in Latin American cities should depart from empirically grounded research, which could account for the differences of the three sources of welfare, as well as the various configurations of social networks and segregation in each city. The existing comparisons focus excessively on economic processes and on markets. On the other hand, the urban studies literature has developed several analyses about segregation and on the production of space in each city, which are for sure key for the understanding of the phenomena all over the region. This could be integrated into the existing debates on markets, on states and social policies, as well as on civil society and on family demography. Probably the missing link on the studies of poverty in the region is a better knowledge about the sociability and social networks. Considering the mediating role of sociability, a more systematic knowledge of the subject could help to integrate all these elements in each city, providing interpretations about the poor that could lead to broader understanding about poverty comparatively.
Thank you very much. That was very impressive. You discussed an entire continent and you did so with a lot of nuance and you timed yourself, which is highly appreciated. You took a bit more time because we have only 2 speakers. My ambition is to put the papers in the dialogue at the end. So I would like to ask for quick questions related specifically to Latin America.
I have a quick question. I enjoyed that. It was interesting. In a lot of geography textbooks or urban cities textbooks, they always start with a model of the Latin American city. I think it was developed by Larry Ford. And I'm just wondering, I think he originally developed that in the 70s and then adapted it in the 90s perhaps, but I'm just wondering, I mean, given how many differences there are in the cities, should that still be included in textbooks? If you're familiar with that model.
You mean of spatial structure?
Yeah, this is more of a spatial structure.
I think in broad terms, the structure of segregation of Latin American cities continues to be the same. But in several cities, especially the Brazilian, larger Brazilian cities, which I know much better, you have important processes of transformation within the peripheries. So which model is this? It's a broadly center periphery model with the richer and wealth and amenities and equipments in the center, and a degree of cascade of precarity to the peripheries. The Brazilian peripheries have been changing a lot since the return to democracy, due to the much larger presence of the state. This is sometimes good, sometimes bad, and sometimes the state is present, but the quality of the service is lousy. But there's something there. There's nothing.
Should it be in the textbook? The picture?
Yeah. Maybe.
Thank you for your presentation. 2 questions. One of the things that you mentioned and that I think that I would like to hear you a little bit more is how homogenic is the periphery and how homogenic are the favelas. I have this idea that they are not as much as homogenic as we might think of, and I know that you have researched on that, and I think it would be interesting to hear you a little bit more on that. And another thing related with this is have we, or as Brazil already produced an assessment of Bolsa Familia program and of its impact, of its urban impact? Have you already had data on that, or are you still waiting or working on an assessment of that policy? And was it relevant in the presence of the state in these contexts?
Well, 2 very important points. The literature developed in the 70s suggested that the peripheries were homogeneous, and marked by the absence of the state, by poverty, by self-construction, and urban precarity, environmental problems. All the information we had since the 2000 census suggested that the peripheries are much more like a mosaic than like something continuous. And they may even seem to be like this if you see from in a satellite image, but when you look at the details, you get several pockets, spatial pockets of social groups. I have plenty of maps with this kind of information. So it's much better to speak about peripheries in the plural than periphery in the singular today. Yeah, and the same thing applies to favelas. It's much better to speak about favelas in the plural than favela as a general phenomenon. In the larger favelas, you have even different sectors with completely different population. In São Paulo, for example, you can group favelas. If you group favelas by social indicators, you'll get a group of favelas with half the average income of another group of favelas. So they are all poor, but they are very different within poverty. And well, Bolsa Família was is very important, has been very important in the reduction of poverty. Brazil reduced its poverty by half, more or less, in the last 10 years. It's still high, but there was an important moment of decrease in poverty in the 90s, associated with the stabilization of the economy during the Cardoso administration. But from that point on, economic restructuring and the opening of the Brazilian economy made poverty increase again. And from 2002, from the beginning of the Lula government, poverty decreased continuously and continue to be like this. The economists are very good on doing this kind of rocket science decomposition of factors and everything, and they show that the Bolsa Família was responsible for 30% of the decrease in poverty, and 70% were due to the return of economic growth, because you had at the same time a very important drop in unemployment and a very large increase in formal jobs. So this was very important, and also a specific policy of the federal government to increase the minimum salary, which had a very important impact in smaller cities. So the three elements combined had a huge impact on poverty.
Thank you very much. I think